The room fell silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. All eyes were on the elderly man as he walked through the glass doors of the car dealership. He wasn't just another customer this time. This time, he owned the place. "Gather around," he said calmly, his voice steady but commanding. The same staff who had ignored him the day before reluctantly shuffled closer, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. "I bought this dealership," he continued, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. "And as of today, all of you are fired." The room erupted. Staff members protested, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of disbelief and panic. Some tried to plead their case, others stood in stunned silence, realizing that the man they had dismissed as unworthy just yesterday now held their livelihoods in his hands. The elderly man, however, remained unmoved. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the storm unfolding before him. "You had your chance to treat me with respect," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Now it's too late." The dealership manager, who had been the ringleader of the previous day's humiliation, stepped forward. "You can't be serious," he stammered, his face pale. The man turned slowly, locking eyes with him. "Do I look like I'm joking?" The silence that followed was deafening. No one knew what to do or say. Just as it seemed things couldn't get any worse for the staff, the man raised a hand, signaling for them to leave. "I expect this place cleared out by the end of the day," he said firmly. As the reality of the situation set in, the manager's knees buckled slightly. But before anyone could argue further, the man's lawyer entered the room, carrying a stack of papers that confirmed the sale. It was done. He wasn't bluffing. What had led to this shocking turn of events? Why would an elderly man go to such lengths to buy a car dealership just to fire its entire staff? And what could possibly happen next? It had all started the day before. The elderly man, Mr. James Harris, had walked into the dealership hoping to purchase a new car. Dressed in his usual modest attire, an old brown jacket, neatly pressed slacks, and a flat cap, he had an air of quiet dignity. But to the staff at the dealership, he was invisible. James stood by the gleaming rows of cars, waiting for assistance. Salesmen buzzed around younger, flashier customers, their polished shoes clicking against the shiny tiled floor. Yet, not a single person approached him. He cleared his throat and took a step toward a salesman who was leaning against a car, scrolling through his phone. "Excuse me, young man," James said politely. "I'm interested in buying a vehicle today." The salesman barely glanced up. "We're kind of busy," he muttered, waving James off as if he were a pesky fly. James frowned but remained patient. He moved to another salesman, a tall man in a crisp blue suit. "I'd like some help looking at your models," he said. The man gave him a once-over, his eyes lingering on James's worn shoes and outdated jacket. "You sure you're in the right place, old-timer?" he said, smirking. "These cars aren't cheap." James felt a knot tighten in his chest. "I'm aware of the prices," he replied calmly. "I'd still like to see your options." The salesman shrugged, clearly uninterested. "You can look around, but don't touch anything," he said before walking away. For the next hour, James tried to get someone's attention, but the response was always the same: dismissive glances, snide comments, and outright neglect. Even the receptionist ignored him, choosing to focus on her nails instead of offering assistance. By the time James left the dealership, he was fuming. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel of his old car. He had never felt so humiliated in his life. But James was not a man to let such treatment slide. He had spent decades building his wealth through hard work and smart investments. If they thought he was just some poor old man, they were sorely mistaken. That night, James made a decision. He would teach them a lesson they would never forget. He contacted his lawyer and began the process of buying the dealership. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about principle. No one should be treated the way he had been treated. By morning, the papers were signed, and James officially owned the dealership. The previous owner, eager to retire, had been more than happy to sell to someone who could pay in full, no questions asked. And now here he was, standing in the very same dealership, wielding the power that had been denied to him the day before. As James watched the staff gather their belongings and shuffle out of the building, he felt a sense of justice. But his work was far from over. He had big plans for the dealership, plans that would change the way it operated and the kind of people it employed. Just as he was lost in thought, a young woman in a crisp black suit entered the room. She carried a briefcase and wore a determined expression. "Mr. Harris," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Rachel, your new general manager. Ready to get started?" James nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Let's rebuild this place the right way," he said. But as Rachel opened her briefcase to review their plans, a loud knock echoed through the dealership doors. James turned to see a group of people standing outside, former staff members who weren't ready to give up without a fight. What would they do next? And how would James handle this new challenge? James stared through the glass doors at the group of ex-employees. Their faces were a mix of anger, desperation, and defiance. The dealership's former manager, Greg, stood at the front, his jaw clenched. Behind him, a few of the salespeople muttered among themselves, clearly rallying for one last stand. Rachel glanced at James. "Do you want me to call security?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. James shook his head. "No need," he replied. "Let's see what they want." With deliberate steps, he walked over and unlocked the doors. Greg wasted no time barging in, followed closely by the others. "You can't do this," Greg barked. "We've worked here for years. You think you can just walk in and destroy people's lives like this?" James raised an eyebrow. "Interesting choice of words," he said coolly. "Destroy people's lives. Isn't that exactly what you tried to do to me yesterday?" Greg's face turned red. "Look, maybe we were out of line, but firing everyone, that's too far." James folded his arms across his chest. "Too far. You all made assumptions about me based on how I looked. You humiliated me, ignored me, and treated me like I didn't belong. This isn't just about you losing your jobs, it's about accountability." Greg opened his mouth to respond, but James cut him off. "Let me make something clear," he said, his voice firm. "This dealership will no longer tolerate discrimination or disrespect. If you came here to apologize, I'm willing to listen. But if you're here to demand your jobs back without acknowledging what you did, you're wasting your time." The room fell silent. Some of the staff shifted uncomfortably, avoiding James's gaze. Finally, one of the younger salesmen, a man named Kyle, stepped forward. I'm sorry, Mr. Harris," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was one of the people who ignored you yesterday, and that was wrong. I don't have an excuse. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." James studied Kyle for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you for your honesty," he said. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Encouraged by Kyle's example, a few more employees stepped forward to apologize. But Greg remained defiant. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. James turned to him. "You have nothing to say, Greg?" Greg crossed his arms. "Fine. Maybe we didn't treat you right, but firing us all isn't the answer. You're just being vindictive." James sighed. "It's not about vengeance, Greg. It's about creating a workplace where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. You had your chance, and you blew it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a business to run." Greg scowled but didn't argue further. He stormed out, followed by the few staff members who hadn't apologized. James watched them go, then turned back to the remaining group. Rachel stepped forward. "What should we do with those who apologized?" she asked. James considered this for a moment. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said. "We'll review their positions, and if they're serious about changing, we'll rehire them under probation." Rachel nodded. "Understood. I'll handle the paperwork." James turned to Kyle and the others. "If you're serious about making things right, come back tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp," he said. "We'll discuss your new roles and expectations." The group nodded, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. As they left the dealership, James felt a sense of satisfaction. He had stood up for himself and set a new standard for the business. But deep down, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Later that evening, James sat in his study, reflecting on the day's events. He was interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," he called. His daughter, Lisa, stepped inside, holding a steaming cup of tea. "I thought you might need this," she said, placing the cup on the desk. James smiled. "Thanks, sweetheart." Lisa sat down across from him. "I heard about what happened today," she said. "You really bought the dealership and fired everyone?" James nodded. "They left me no choice," he said, "but I'm giving some of them a chance to redeem themselves." Lisa sighed. "You've always been fair, Dad, but are you sure this is what you want? Running a car dealership is a big responsibility." James chuckled. "I'm not planning to run it forever," he said, "just long enough to turn things around and set a better example." Lisa nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if anyone can do it, you can." As they talked, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every person who had ever been judged unfairly or treated with disrespect. This was his chance to make a difference. The next morning, James arrived at the dealership early, ready to start fresh. Rachel was already there, reviewing the day's agenda. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," she said, handing him a clipboard. Here's a schedule for today. James scanned the list, nodding approval. Looks good, he said. Let's get to work. As the clock struck 9 a.m., Kyle and the other apologetic employees arrived, looking nervous but eager. James welcomed them and led them into the conference room for a meeting. He outlined his vision for the dealership, emphasizing the importance of respect, integrity, and teamwork. We're going to create a place where everyone feels valued, he said, and that starts with each of you. The employees listened intently, nodding in agreement. James felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could turn this place around. But just as the meeting was wrapping up, Rachel burst into the room, her face pale. "Mr. Harris," she said urgently, "you need to see this." James followed her to the front of the dealership, where a police car was parked outside. Two officers were speaking with Greg, who was gesturing angrily toward the building. "What's going on?" James asked, stepping outside. One of the officers turned to him. "Are you the owner of this dealership?" he asked. James nodded. "That's right." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "We received a report from Mr. Greg Wilson here," he said. "He's claiming you've been involved in some illegal business practices." James's eyes narrowed. "Illegal business practices? That's absurd." Greg smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. "We'll see about that," he said smugly. James knew this wasn't over. Greg was playing dirty, and he had to be prepared for whatever came next. But one thing was certain, he wasn't backing down. James felt his pulse quicken as he locked eyes with Greg. The man's smug expression was a stark reminder that some people would go to great lengths to undermine others when they felt threatened. James wasn't sure what Greg had told the police, but he was confident there was no truth to it. However, he knew that in situations like this, perception often mattered more than facts. The lead officer cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. "Mr. Harris, we'd like to ask you a few questions. Do you have a moment?" James nodded, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "Of course, officer. Let's step into my office." He led the officers through the dealership, passing by employees who had gathered, their faces etched with worry. Rachel stayed close, her sharp eyes watching every move. Once inside James's office, the officers took a seat, while Greg lingered by the door, arms crossed. James gestured toward him. "Is he going to be part of this conversation?" The officer glanced back at Greg, then shook his head. "No, Mr. Wilson, we'll handle it from here." Greg hesitated, but eventually walked out, muttering under his breath. James shut the door firmly behind him and took a seat. "Now," he said, folding his hands on the desk, "what exactly has Mr. Wilson accused me of?" The officer flipped open a notepad. "He's alleging that the recent purchase of this dealership was conducted under fraudulent pretenses," he said. "Specifically, he claims you used insider information and pressured the former owner into selling below market value." James raised an eyebrow. "That's ridiculous," he said. "The sale was entirely above board. I paid the full asking price, and the former owner was more than happy with the deal." The second officer, who had remained quiet until now, chimed in. "Do you have documentation to prove that?" James nodded. "I do. Rachel, could you please retrieve the purchase agreement and payment records from my file cabinet?" Rachel, who had been standing by the window, immediately moved to the cabinet and pulled out a folder. She handed it to James, who placed it on the desk for the officers to review. The lead officer examined the documents carefully, his partner peering over his shoulder. After a few minutes, he closed the folder and nodded. "Everything appears to be in order," he said. "We'll need to verify this with the former owner, but from what I see here, there's no evidence of wrongdoing." James leaned back in his chair, a small smile forming on his lips. "I told you," he said. "This is nothing more than a baseless accusation." The officer stood, tucking the notepad back into his pocket. "We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Harris. We'll follow up if we need anything further, but for now, you're free to continue with your business." As the officers left, James felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. He knew Greg wouldn't stop here. The man was desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. Once the police were gone, Rachel closed the office door and turned to James. "That was close," she said. "Do you think Greg will try something else?" James nodded. "Without a doubt," he said, "but we'll be ready for him." He stood and walked over to the window, watching as Greg paced in the parking lot, speaking animatedly into his phone. It was clear the man was plotting his next move. "Rachel," James said, his voice firm, "I want you to keep a close eye on everything. Any unusual activity, any strange calls, let me know immediately." Rachel nodded. "Consider it done." James turned back to the desk, his mind racing. He needed to stay one step ahead, and that meant anticipating Greg's next move. But for now, there was work to be done. As the day went on, James focused on rebuilding the dealership's operations. He and Rachel worked tirelessly, implementing new policies and procedures designed to create a more inclusive and respectful workplace. They held meetings with the remaining staff, setting clear expectations and offering training to help them improve their customer service skills. Kyle, the young salesman who had been among the first to apologize, showed particular promise. He was eager to learn and quickly adapted to the new standards. James saw in him a potential leader, someone who could help set the tone for the rest of the team. By the end of the day, James felt a sense of accomplishment. Despite the challenges, progress was being made, but just as he was about to head home, Rachel knocked on his office door, her expression grim. "We have a problem," she said. James's heart sank. "What is it?" Rachel held up her phone. "It's a social media post," she said, handing the phone to James. James took the phone and read the post, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the screen. It was a long, inflammatory rant from Greg, accusing James of unethical practices and calling for a boycott of the dealership. The post had already gained traction, with dozens of comments and shares. "This is bad," Rachel said. "He's trying to ruin our reputation." James clenched his jaw. "Let him try it," he said. "We'll respond, but we'll do it on our terms." He handed the phone back to Rachel. "Draft a statement," he said. "Make it clear that these accusations are false, and that we're committed to transparency and fairness." Rachel nodded and left the room, leaving James to his thoughts. He knew this was only the beginning. Greg was playing dirty, and the battle was far from over. But James was ready. He had faced adversity before, and he wasn't about to back down now. As he sat in the quiet of his office, the weight of the day's events pressed down on him. But even in the face of these challenges, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about running a dealership, it was about standing up for what was right. And he wouldn't stop until the fight was won. That night, as James prepared to leave, he noticed a figure lurking near his car. He stepped closer, squinting in the dim light. It was Greg, his face twisted in anger. "You think you've won?" Greg hissed, stepping forward. "This isn't over, old man." James stared at him, unflinching. "Get off my property, Greg," he said, his voice low and steady. "You've already embarrassed yourself enough." Greg's fists clenched, but he didn't move. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but then he turned and stormed off, disappearing into the night. James watched him go, his heart pounding. He knew Greg was dangerous, and the next move could be even more extreme. But James was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. The question now was, what would Greg do next? The next morning, James arrived at the dealership earlier than usual. The sky was still dark, the city barely stirring, but James needed the quiet to plan his next steps. He unlocked the front doors and walked through the silent showroom, the rows of gleaming cars reflecting the soft glow of the overhead lights. He made his way to his office, flicked on the desk lamp, and sat down. A steaming cup of coffee sat waiting for him, courtesy of Rachel, who had left it with a note. "We got this." James smiled, appreciating her steady support. But as he sipped the coffee, his mind wandered back to Greg's ominous warning the night before. Greg was clearly unhinged, and James knew the man wouldn't stop until he felt vindicated, or until James was out of the picture entirely. The thought was interrupted by a sudden noise. James froze, listening. It was faint but distinct, the sound of footsteps echoing through the empty dealership. He stood, his heart rate quickening, and moved toward the door. Peering out into the darkened showroom, he saw nothing. But the sense of unease lingered. "Rachel?" He called out, though he knew she wasn't due for another hour. No response. James reached for his phone, intending to call security, when the footsteps sounded again, this time closer. He stepped cautiously into the showroom, scanning the room for any signs of movement. The faint hum of the building's electrical systems was the only sound. "Who's there?" James demanded, his voice echoing in the vast space. Suddenly, a shadow darted across the far side of the room, near the service entrance. James's grip tightened on his phone as he edged closer. He reached the door and slowly pushed it open, revealing the dimly lit service bay. To his shock, he found Greg standing there, his face a mixture of rage and desperation. In his hand was a crowbar. "You just couldn't let it go, could you?" Greg snarled, his voice low but venomous. "You had to ruin everything." James held his ground, his voice calm but firm. "What are you doing here, Greg? This is breaking and entering. Walk away now, and I won't call the police." Greg let out a bitter laugh. "Police? You think they'll do anything?" He You already got them in your pocket, just like you've got everyone else fooled. James took a step forward, keeping his voice steady. Greg, listen to yourself. This isn't going to end well for you. Put the crowbar down and leave. But Greg shook his head, his grip on the crowbar tightening. You don't get it, do you? He sent his voice, trembling with barely contained fury. This dealership was my life. You took it from me. Now I'm taking something from you. Before James could react, Greg swung the crowbar, smashing it into the side of a nearby car. The loud crash echoed through the bay as glass shattered and the car alarm blared to life. James stepped back, his heart pounding. Greg, stop this. He shouted over the wailing alarm. But Greg was beyond reason. He moved to another car, raising the crowbar again. James knew he had to act fast. He dialed 911 and quickly explained the situation, keeping his eyes on Greg the entire time. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached. Greg's wild eyes darted toward the sound, and for a moment, he seemed to consider fleeing. But instead, he dropped the crowbar and raised his hands in surrender, a bitter smile on his face. Congratulations, Harris, he sneered as the police burst in, their guns drawn. You win. The officers quickly subdued Greg, cuffing him and leading him away. As they passed James, one of the officers paused. Are you all right, Mr. Harris? James nodded, though his hands were still trembling. I'm fine, he said. Thank you for getting here so quickly. The officer nodded and followed his partner, leaving James alone in the service bay. The alarms had finally silenced, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. James took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Rachel arrived shortly after, her face pale as she surveyed the damage. What happened? She asked, her voice filled with concern. Greg happened, James said grimly. He broke in and started smashing cars. Rachel's eyes widened. Is he? He's in police custody now, James assured her. But this isn't over. We need to get ahead of this before it affects our business. Rachel nodded. I'll start coordinating with our legal team and the insurance company, she said, and we'll need to release a statement to reassure our customers. James placed a hand on her shoulder. Thank you, Rachel, he said. We'll get through this. By midday, the dealership was bustling with activity. Cleanup crews worked to repair the damaged cars, while Rachel and the legal team handled the fallout from the incident. James spent the afternoon meeting with employees, reassuring them and reinforcing the importance of their mission. Despite the chaos of the morning, James felt a renewed sense of determination. Greg's actions had been a desperate attempt to derail his efforts, but they had only strengthened his resolve. As the day drew to a close, James sat in his office, reflecting on the challenges they had faced. Just as he was beginning to feel a sense of relief, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Rachel. James, you need to see this, she said, her voice urgent. James's stomach tightened. What is it? There's a video of the incident circulating online, Rachel said. Someone recorded Greg smashing the cars and yelling about you. It's going viral. James's heart sank. This was a new battle, one that would play out in the court of public opinion. And he knew that every move they made from this point forward would be under intense scrutiny. As he hung up the phone, James realized that the fight for the dealership's future was far from over. Greg may have been in custody, but his actions were still causing ripple effects that could threaten everything James had worked for. The question now was, how would James handle the growing public backlash? James wasted no time. The moment he hung up, he called Rachel back to his office. Within minutes, she was there, laptop in hand, her expression as serious as ever. It's bad, James, she said, setting the laptop on his desk and pressing play on a video that had already amassed tens of thousands of views. The footage was shaky, clearly recorded on a phone. It showed Greg in the act of smashing the dealership's cars, his voice audible over the alarm. This is what happens when a fraud buys out your life's work. This man doesn't care about you or this business. The video then panned to James standing calmly, phone in hand, before cutting off abruptly. The comments below were a mix of support and outrage. Wow, what's the full story here? This Greg guy seems unhinged, but why is the new owner so calm? Feels shady. James Harris is a local hero. Don't let this crazy guy bring him down. Never shopping at this dealership again until they clear this up. Rachel paused the video and sighed. It's spreading fast. If we don't get ahead of this, it could seriously damage our reputation. James leaned back, rubbing his temples. We need a response, fast, but it has to be the right one. Rachel nodded. I've drafted a statement, she said, pulling out her phone. It emphasizes transparency, condemns Greg's actions and reassures customers that we're handling everything professionally. James read over the statement carefully, nodding approval. "This is good," he said. "But it's not enough. We need to control the narrative." Rachel tilted her head. "What do you have in mind?" James stood, his eyes filled with determination. "A press conference. We'll invite the media here, show them the damage Greg caused, and tell our side of the story. We're not just going to react, we're going to lead." Rachel's eyes widened slightly. "That's a bold move," she said. "But it could work, especially if we frame it as a commitment to integrity and community." James smiled. "Exactly. Let's show them that we're not hiding anything and that we're here to stay." By the next morning, the dealership was buzzing with activity. Reporters from local news outlets and national networks had gathered, cameras and microphones at the ready. The once damaged cars had been moved to the front of the showroom, their broken windows and dented frames a stark reminder of the chaos Greg had caused. James stood at a podium, flanked by Rachel and Kyle, who had stepped up as a spokesperson for the employees. As the crowd quieted, James took a deep breath and began. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady. "Thank you all for being here. As many of you know, an incident occurred at this dealership that has raised questions and concerns. I'm here to address those directly." He gestured toward the damaged cars. These vehicles were vandalized by a former employee, Greg Wilson, who acted out of anger and frustration. While his actions were extreme and unacceptable, they highlight a larger issue: the importance of integrity, respect, and accountability in the workplace. James paused, letting his words sink in. "When I purchased this dealership, I did so with a vision: to create a business that values every customer and employee, regardless of their background or appearance. What happened here was a test of that vision, and I want to assure you all that we're committed to rising above it." He then turned to Kyle, who stepped forward. "I've worked here for a few years," Kyle said, his voice filled with emotion. "And I'll admit, we haven't always gotten it right. But under Mr. Harris' leadership, we're learning, growing, and building something better. We're not just selling cars, we're building trust." The reporters began firing questions, and James answered each one with honesty and transparency. He explained the circumstances of the dealership's purchase, his plans for the future, and his commitment to fostering a positive, inclusive environment. As the press conference wrapped up, a reporter raised a final question. "Mr. Harris, what do you say to those who are still skeptical about your leadership?" James smiled, his eyes reflecting both confidence and humility. "I'd say this: actions speak louder than words. Watch what we do, and judge us by our results." The press conference was a success. By the end of the day, news outlets were running favorable stories about James's leadership and the dealership's transformation. Social media buzzed with positive reactions, and customers began to show their support, some even stopping by to express their confidence in James and his team. But just as things seemed to be turning around, Rachel walked into James's office, her face grim. "We got another problem," she said, handing him a tablet. James's heart sank as he read the headline. "Former manager Greg Wilson sues dealership for unlawful termination and defamation. They're claiming we fired him without cause and at our press conference damaged his reputation," Rachel explained. James set the tablet down, his jaw tightening. "He's trying to drag us into a legal battle." Rachel nodded. "We'll need to prepare for a fight. This could get messy." James took a deep breath, his mind already racing with strategies. "Then we'll fight," he said firmly, "but we'll do it the right way." As Rachel left to contact the legal team, James sat back, his resolve stronger than ever. Greg had thrown another punch, but James wasn't about to go down. The dealership's future and his own integrity depended on it. The question was, how far would Greg go, and what other surprises did he have up his sleeve? James spent the night going over legal documents, preparing himself for what was shaping up to be a fierce courtroom battle. His lawyer, Charles Duncan, was an old friend with a reputation for being sharp and relentless. They had met earlier that evening to discuss Greg's lawsuit. "This lawsuit is a weak attempt to intimidate you," Charles had said confidently, tapping the stack of papers on James's desk. "Greg's claims don't hold water, especially given his criminal actions at the dealership. But we need to handle this carefully to avoid unnecessary damage to your reputation." James had nodded, grateful for Charles' expertise but aware of the uphill climb ahead. Greg was not only persistent but also cunning, and he seemed determined to drag James and the dealership through the mud. The next morning, James arrived at the dealership early again, greeted by Rachel, who had already set up a meeting with the legal team. "Charles will be here soon," she said, handing James a fresh cup of coffee. "We've also started receiving customer inquiries about the lawsuit. Some are worried about the dealership's future." James sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Let's reassure them," he said. "Send out a message that the dealership is fully operational and committed to serving our community." Rachel nodded and got to work. An hour later, Charles arrived, his leather briefcase in hand. He exuded confidence as he walked into the conference room where James, Rachel, and Kyle were waiting. "Good to see you all," Charles said, setting his briefcase on the table. "Let's get down to business." He pulled out a series of documents and laid them out. Greg's lawsuit hinges on two main claims: unlawful termination and defamation. For the termination claim, we'll present evidence of his misconduct, including witness testimonies and security footage from the night he vandalized the dealership. Kyle raised a hand. "I was there that night," he said. "I'll testify if needed." Charles nodded. "Good. Now, as for the defamation claim, we'll argue that our press conference was a necessary response to Greg's actions and was conducted in a factual and professional manner." Rachel chimed in. "We have a recording of the press conference. It was transparent and focused on rebuilding trust." "Excellent," Charles said, making notes. "We'll also file a countersuit for damages related to the vandalism and the negative impact on the dealership's reputation." James listened carefully, his confidence growing with each point. "Charles," he said, "I want to make sure we handle this with integrity. I don't want to stoop to Greg's level, but I also won't let him bully us." Charles smiled. "That's why I'm here, James. We'll play this smart and fair, but we won't back down." The lawsuit quickly became the talk of the town. News outlets covered the story, with some framing it as a battle of principles between two former colleagues. James's calm demeanor during interviews and public statements won him praise, while Greg's erratic behavior only fueled skepticism about his claims. But Greg wasn't done playing dirty. One afternoon, Rachel rushed into James's office, her face pale. "James, we have a serious problem," she said, handing him her tablet. James's eyes widened as he read the headline. "Leaked emails suggest shady deal in dealership purchase." The article claimed to have obtained confidential emails between James and the former owner, hinting at unethical negotiations. "This is nonsense," James said, his voice firm. "There were no shady deals. The purchase was entirely legal and transparent." Rachel nodded. "I know, but the damage is already done. People are starting to question your integrity." James clenched his jaw. "Who leaked these emails?" Rachel shook her head. "We're looking into it, but my guess is Greg. He's trying to undermine you at every turn." James stood, his mind racing. "Get Charles on the line," he said. "We need to address this immediately." Within minutes, Charles was on speakerphone, his voice calm but serious. "I've seen the article," he said. "If those emails are real, we'll need to verify their authenticity and context. If they're fabricated or taken out of context, we can take legal action against the publication." James nodded. "What's our next move?" "We'll issue a public statement denying the allegations and provide evidence of the legitimate purchase process," Charles said, "but we need to act fast to control the narrative." Rachel leaned forward. "Should we hold another press conference?" Charles considered this. "It's risky, but it could work if we frame it correctly. We'll position James as a transparent leader facing baseless attacks." James agreed. "Let's do it. We can't let Greg's lies define us." The following day, James stood before the press once again. This time, he brought the former owner of the dealership, Mr. Leonard Price, as a key witness. "Thank you all for being here," James began, his voice steady. "Recent reports have questioned the legitimacy of my purchase of this dealership. I'm here today to set the record straight." He gestured to Leonard, who stepped forward. "Mr. Price, can you confirm the details of our transaction?" Leonard nodded. "Absolutely. James Harris purchased this dealership fair and square. There was no coercion, no shady deals. Everything was above board." James then presented the original purchase agreement and payment records, which the press eagerly photographed. "These documents, along with Mr. Price's testimony, prove that the allegations are false," James said. "We will not tolerate attempts to smear our reputation." The press conference ended on a strong note, with reporters applauding James's transparency. But as James returned to his office, he couldn't shake the feeling that Greg had more tricks up his sleeve. That night, as James prepared to leave, his phone buzzed with a new email. The subject line read, "Final warning." James opened the email and read its chilling contents. "This isn't over, Harris. You made it one today, but I'm not done yet. Watch your back." James's grip on his phone tightened. Greg's campaign of sabotage was far from over, but James was ready to face whatever came next, determined to protect everything he had built. The question now was, how far would Greg go to exact his revenge, and what lengths would James have to go to stop him? James sat in his office, staring at the ominous email. He had faced challenges before, but Greg's relentless vendetta was unlike anything he'd experienced. The man was determined to destroy everything James had built, no matter the cost. Rachel walked in moments later, carrying a folder. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, noticing his tense expression. James turned the screen toward her. "Take a look at this." Rachel read the email, her face darkening. "This is serious," she said. "We need to report this to the police." James nodded. "I agreed, but we need to be strategic. Greg's already in enough legal trouble, but if he's making threats, we can't take any chances." Rachel pulled out her phone. "I'll call Charles and get the police involved," she said. "In the meantime, we should increase security around the dealership." James stood, his mind racing. "Do it, and make sure all our employees are briefed on what's happening. I don't want anyone else getting caught in the crossfire." Later that afternoon, Charles arrived with a detective from the local police department. Detective Sanders was a seasoned officer with a no-nonsense attitude. He sat across from James, a notepad in hand. "I've reviewed the email," Sanders said, his tone calm but serious. "This kind of threat is not something we take lightly. We'll launch a formal investigation into Greg's activities and provide additional patrols around the dealership." James appreciated the swift action but couldn't shake the feeling that Greg was always one step ahead. "Thank you, Detective," he said. "I just want to ensure the safety of my employees and customers." Sanders nodded. "We'll do everything we can. In the meantime, be cautious. If Greg is desperate enough to send threats, there's no telling what he might do next." As the detective left, James leaned back in his chair, his mind filled with uncertainty. Greg's escalating behavior was a clear sign that the man was spiraling, but James knew he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. That evening, James returned home, hoping to find some peace. His daughter, Lisa, greeted him at the door, a worried look on her face. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked. "I saw the news about the lawsuit and the threats." James hugged her, trying to reassure her. "I'm fine, Lisa. It's been a rough few days, but we're handling it." Lisa led him to the living room, where a news report was playing. The headline read, "Local business owner faces harassment campaign amidst legal battle." James watched as the reporter recounted the events of the past week, including the vandalism, the lawsuit, and the threats. The segment ended with a clip of James's press conference, where he had confidently defended his actions. "You've been through a lot," Lisa said, sitting beside him, "but I'm proud of how you're handling it." James smiled, grateful for her support. "Thanks, sweetheart. It's not easy, but I've come too far to back down now." Lisa nodded. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," James said. "I promise." The next day, James arrived at the dealership to find a surprising sight. A crowd of customers and community members gathered outside, holding signs of support. Messages like "We stand with James and integrity matters" were written in bold letters. Rachel met him at the entrance, her face lit up with excitement. "The community is rallying behind us," she said. "People are tired of Greg's antics, and they want to show their support." James felt a wave of gratitude. "This means more than they know," he said. "Let's make sure we thank everyone who came out." He stepped outside, addressing the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Your support means everything to us. We're committed to serving this community with honesty and respect, and we won't let anything stand in our way." The crowd erupted in applause, and James felt a renewed sense of purpose. Despite Greg's attempts to tear him down, the community's support proved that his efforts were making a difference. But just as the day seemed to take a positive turn, Rachel received a call from Detective Sanders. She quickly handed the phone to James, her expression serious. "Mr. Harris," Sanders said on the other end, "we've got a situation. Greg was released on bail earlier today, and he's already making moves. He's been seen meeting with some unsavory characters." James's stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" "We're still gathering information," Sanders said, "but it looks like he's trying to recruit help to escalate his campaign against you. We'll keep you updated, but I thought you should know." James thanked the detective and hung up, his mind racing. Greg's desperation was reaching new heights, and it was clear he wasn't done yet. James turned to Rachel, his jaw set. "We need to prepare for whatever's coming," he said. "Greg won't stop until he's forced to." Rachel nodded. "I'll tighten security and make sure everyone stays vigilant." James took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges ahead. Greg's next move could be the most dangerous yet, and James had to be ready. The question now was, how far would Greg go, and could James protect the dealership and everyone around him before it was too late? The tension in the air was palpable as James and Rachel prepared the dealership for whatever Greg might throw their way. Security was tightened, with surveillance cameras installed at every entry point and a private firm hired to patrol the premises 24/7. Employees were briefed on emergency procedures, and every customer interaction was closely monitored. Despite these precautions, James couldn't shake the feeling that Greg's next move would be something they weren't prepared for. Later that week, as the dealership buzzed with its usual activity, a delivery truck pulled into the lot. The driver stepped out, holding a clipboard. He approached the front desk, where Kyle was stationed. "Got a delivery for Mr. Harris," the driver said, handing over the paperwork. Kyle frowned, glancing at the document. "We weren't expecting any shipments today," he said. "What's in the truck?" The driver shrugged. "Just doing my job, man. Says here it's some promotional materials." Kyle nodded but felt uneasy. He called Rachel, who quickly joined him at the front. Together, they inspected the delivery paperwork, but something felt off. Rachel made a quick decision. "Let's have security check the truck before we unload anything." The driver seemed annoyed but complied as two security guards began inspecting the cargo. Minutes later, one of them called Rachel over, his face grim. "You need to see this," he said, pulling back a tarp to reveal several crates labeled with false company names. Rachel's heart sank. She opened one of the crates and found stacks of counterfeit car parts, brake pads, filters, and more. It was a setup. "Call James," she said, her voice tight. James arrived moments later, his expression darkening as Rachel explained the situation. "This is Greg's doing," he said. "He's trying to frame us for selling counterfeit parts." Rachel nodded. "We need to act fast. If this gets out, it could ruin our reputation." James turned to the driver, who now looked nervous. "Who hired you to make this delivery?" he asked. The driver stammered. "I don't know. I just got the order from my dispatcher." James glanced at Rachel. "Get Detective Sanders on the phone. We need to report this immediately." Detective Sanders arrived within the hour, accompanied by a forensic team. They carefully documented the contents of the truck, taking photographs and gathering evidence. "This is serious," Sanders said, his face grim. "If these parts had made it into your inventory, it could have been disastrous." James nodded. "Greg is desperate, but he's crossed the line. We need to stop him before he does more damage." Sanders agreed. "We'll trace the shipment back to its source. If Greg's behind this, we'll make sure he's held accountable." As the police worked, James gathered his staff in the conference room. He stood before them, his expression serious but determined. "Today, we faced another attack on our integrity," he said. "But let me be clear. We will not be intimidated. We're a team, and together, we'll overcome this." The room erupted in applause, and James felt a renewed sense of resolve. Despite Greg's efforts, the dealership's spirit remained unbroken. That night, as James reviewed the day's events, he received an email from an anonymous sender. The message contained a single sentence: "The worst is yet to come." James stared at the screen, his mind racing. Greg's threats were escalating, and it was clear he wouldn't stop until he had destroyed everything James had worked for. But James wasn't about to back down. He had come too far, and he was prepared to fight for what was right. The next day, Detective Sanders called with an update. "We traced the shipment to a warehouse on the outskirts of town," he said. "It's owned by a shell company, but we have reason to believe Greg is using it as a base of operations." James felt a surge of hope. "Can you shut it down?" "We're working on getting a warrant," Sanders said. "Once we have it, we'll raid the warehouse and gather whatever evidence we can." James thanked the detective and hung up. He shared the news with Rachel, who immediately began coordinating with the legal team. "This could be the break we need," Rachel said. "If we can tie Greg to the warehouse, it'll strengthen our case against him." James nodded. "Let's stay focused. We're getting closer to the truth." That evening, as James prepared to leave, he received a call from Sanders. "We got the warrant," Sanders said. "The raid is happening tonight." James's heart raced. "Do you think it'll be enough to stop him?" "We'll know soon enough," Sanders replied. "But you should be prepared for anything." As James hung up, he couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The raid could be a turning point, but it could also provoke Greg into taking even more drastic measures. James knew the next 24 hours would be critical. The question was, Would the raid bring an end to Greg's reign of terror, or would it ignite a new wave of chaos? The night of the raid felt like the climax of a long, grueling battle. James sat in his office, phone in hand, waiting for any updates from Detective Sanders. His mind raced with thoughts of what the police might uncover in the warehouse. If Greg's operation was as elaborate as it seemed, the evidence could finally put an end to his schemes. Rachel stayed by his side, a silent but steady presence. Every few minutes, she glanced at her phone, checking for news. "Whatever happens tonight," she said quietly, "we've done everything we can to protect this dealership." James nodded, grateful for her unwavering support. "We'll get through this," he said, more to himself than to Rachel. At 11:37 p.m., James's phone buzzed. It was Sanders. "We've got him," Sanders said, his voice firm. The raid was a success. "We found counterfeit parts, falsified documents, and even a ledger detailing payments made to Greg. It's solid evidence." James exhaled, relief washing over him. "That's the best news I've heard in weeks. What happens next?" "We've arrested several of Greg's accomplices," Sanders continued. "Greg wasn't at the warehouse, but with the evidence we've collected, we'll have no trouble issuing a warrant for his arrest. It's only a matter of time before we bring him in." James's sense of victory was tempered by the knowledge that Greg was still out there. But for the first time in days, he felt hope. "Thank you, Detective. Keep me updated." As James ended the call, he shared the news with Rachel. "They've got everything they need to take Greg down," he said. Rachel allowed herself a small smile. Finally, some justice. The next morning, the news broke. Headlines across the city read, "Counterfeit car parts, ring busted in police raid, and former dealership manager wanted for fraud and vandalism." The dealership received an outpouring of support from the community. Customers called to express their solidarity, and local businesses offered their assistance. Even employees who had been skeptical of James's leadership began to see him in a new light. James addressed the staff in a meeting, his tone one of cautious optimism. "This is a significant step forward," he said, "but we need to stay vigilant. Greg may be on the run, but he won't stay quiet for long." Kyle raised his hand. "Do you think he'll come after us again?" James didn't sugarcoat his response. "It's possible," he said, "but we're prepared. With the community behind us and the law on our side, we'll face whatever comes our way." The employees nodded, their determination renewed. For the next few days, things seemed to settle down. Business at the dealership picked up, and the team worked together to rebuild trust with their customers. James felt a sense of pride watching his employees thrive under the new leadership model he had implemented. But the peace didn't last. One evening, as James was locking up the dealership, his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "James Harris," he said. A chillingly familiar voice came through the line. "You thought you'd won, didn't you?" James's heart sank. "Greg." "Enjoy your little victory while it lasts," Greg continued, his tone menacing. "You have no idea what's coming." The line went dead before James could respond. He stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. What could Greg be planning? And how much danger was the dealership, and everyone in it truly in? James immediately called Detective Sanders and relayed the conversation. "We'll trace the call," Sanders said. "In the meantime, increase security. Greg's clearly desperate, and desperate men do desperate things." The next morning, James called an emergency meeting with Rachel and the security team. "Greg contacted me last night," he said. "He's planning something, but we don't know what. I want this dealership on high alert." Rachel nodded, her expression grim. "We'll double the security presence and run background checks on anyone who comes in." James turned to the head of security. "Can we set up a panic button system in key areas of the dealership?" "Already in progress," the man replied. "We'll have it ready by the end of the day." As they worked to fortify the dealership, James couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Greg was cornered, and a cornered animal was always the most dangerous. That night, as the last employees were leaving, James stayed behind to go over the day's reports. The dealership was quiet, the only sounds the hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustle of papers. Suddenly, the lights flickered. James looked up, his senses on high alert. A moment later, the building was plunged into darkness. He reached for his phone, but before he could make a call, he heard the sound of glass shattering in the showroom. His heart pounded as he realized what was happening. Greg had made his move. James quickly activated the silent alarm on his phone, which would alert both the police and the security team. Then he grabbed a flashlight from his desk and made his way cautiously toward the showroom. As he approached, he saw the silhouette of a man moving through the darkness. It was Greg, holding a crowbar and smashing display cases as he went. "Greg," James called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "It's over. The police are on their way." Greg turned, his face illuminated briefly by the moonlight streaming through the shattered windows. "Not yet, old man," he sneered. "Not until I've finished what I started." James stood his ground, ready for whatever came next. The question was, how far was Greg willing to go? And could James stop him before it was too late? The silence in the showroom was broken only by the crunch of glass under Greg's feet as he stalked toward James, the crowbar gripped tightly in his hand. James stood firm, his flashlight beam steady on Greg's face. "You don't have to do this," James said, his voice calm but resolute. "It's over. The evidence is stacked against you, and the police are already on their way. Don't make things worse for yourself." Greg let out a bitter laugh. "Worse? You think you've already ruined me, but you don't get it. You're the one who took everything from me." He swung the crowbar at a nearby desk, sending papers flying. "This place was my life, and you waltzed in and took it like it was nothing." James took a slow step forward, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "Greg, you need to let this go. You're not going to win this way." Greg's eyes narrowed. "I've got nothing left to lose, Harris. That makes me dangerous." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tense moment, their wails growing louder by the second. Greg's expression flickered with uncertainty, but his grip on the crowbar didn't waver. "They're almost here," James said. "You still have a chance to walk out of here peacefully." Greg shook his head, his jaw clenched. "You think you're better than me. You think your money and your speeches make you some kind of hero. But you're just another man who stepped on someone to get to the top." James' eyes softened. "I never wanted to step on anyone, Greg. I just wanted a fair chance, the same chance everyone deserves. You let your anger blind you, but it doesn't have to end like this." For a moment, it seemed as though Greg might lower the crowbar. His shoulders sagged slightly, and the fire in his eyes dimmed. But just as quickly, his face hardened again. "I'm not going down without a fight," he growled, raising the crowbar once more. Before he could take another step, the showroom doors burst open, and a team of police officers flooded in, their weapons drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of the officers commanded, their voice firm. Greg froze, his eyes darting between James and the officers. For a tense moment, it seemed he might refuse. Then, with a frustrated roar, he flung the crowbar to the ground and raised his hands. The officers moved in swiftly, cuffing Greg and reading him his rights. As they led him away, Greg shot one last venomous look at James. "This isn't over," he muttered. James stood silently, watching as Greg was escorted out of the dealership. The weight of the night's events settled heavily on his shoulders, but he felt a sense of relief knowing that Greg was finally in custody. Detective Sanders approached James, his expression serious but calm. "You did the right thing, calling us when you did," he said. "Greg's actions tonight will only strengthen the case against him." James nodded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. "I just wanted to prevent anyone from getting hurt." Sanders glanced around the damaged showroom. "We'll file additional charges for tonight's incident. With everything we have on him, Greg won't be causing trouble for a long time." James sighed, the tension beginning to ebb. "Thank you, Detective. It's been a long road." Sanders placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. "You've handled this with integrity, Mr. Harris. That's not something we see often." As the police finished their work, James and Rachel surveyed the damage. The broken glass, overturned furniture, and shattered display cases were a stark reminder of the chaos Greg had caused. "This could have been much worse," Rachel said, her voice low. James nodded. "We'll rebuild, just like we always do." Rachel gave him a small smile. "The team will be here first thing in the morning to help. We're all in this together." James felt a swell of pride. Despite everything, the dealership had become more than just a business. It was a community, and together, they would overcome any challenge. The following days were a whirlwind of repairs and legal proceedings. With Greg in custody, the dealership's reputation began to recover. Customers returned, reassured by James's unwavering commitment to transparency and fairness. James held another press conference, addressing the events of the past weeks. He spoke candidly about the challenges they had faced and the lessons they had learned. "We've been tested in ways we never could have imagined," he said. "But through it all, we've remained true to our values. This dealership is more than just a place to buy cars. It's a symbol of resilience and community." The press conference was met with widespread support, and the dealership's future looked brighter than ever. One evening, As James sat in his office, reflecting on the journey he had been through, Rachel knocked on the door. "You got a visitor," she said with a smile. James looked up, surprised to see Kyle standing in the doorway with a young boy by his side. "Mr. Harris," Kyle said, "this is my son, Ethan. You wanted to meet the man I've been telling him about." James smiled warmly and stood, extending a hand to Ethan. "It's nice to meet you, young man." Ethan grinned shyly. "My dad says you're a hero." James chuckled. "Your dad's the real hero. He stood up for what's right and helped make this dealership what it is today." As they talked, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The battles he had fought weren't just for himself. They were for everyone who believed in doing the right thing, no matter the odds. But even as he enjoyed this moment of peace, James knew that life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges. The question now was, what new adventures lay ahead, and how would he face them with the same determination and courage? For now, though, he allowed himself to savor the victory, knowing that he had earned every bit of it. Life at the dealership gradually returned to normal, but James knew the peace was hard-earned. The staff worked harder than ever, not just to rebuild the business, but to honor the values that James had instilled: respect, fairness, and integrity. One sunny afternoon, as customers browsed the showroom, Rachel walked into James's office with an envelope in hand. "This just came in," she said, placing it on his desk. James glanced at the envelope, noting the return address from the district court. He opened it carefully, pulling out the official letter. "It's Greg's sentencing date," James said after reading it. 2 weeks from now." Rachel sat down. "How do you feel about it?" James leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Relief, I suppose. But it's bittersweet. Greg had the potential to do great things, but he let his anger and pride consume him." Rachel nodded. "Not everyone can see beyond their own pain. But he gave him chances, James, more than most would have." James sighed. "Maybe. Still, I can't help but think of how different things could have been if he'd made different choices." They sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. Then Rachel's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "James, you need to see this," she said, handing him her phone. James read the headline, "Former Manager Greg Wilson to represent himself in court." His eyebrows shot up. "He's representing himself." Rachel nodded. "Looks like he's doubling down on his arrogance. He probably thinks he can outsmart the system." James set the phone down, a mix of concern and disbelief on his face. This trial is going to be a spectacle. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, community members, and employees from the dealership filled the seats, eager to witness the culmination of the saga that had gripped the town for months. James sat near the front, accompanied by Rachel and Charles. He felt a mixture of anticipation and unease as the trial began. Greg, dressed in a sharp suit but wearing a defiant smirk, stood confidently as he delivered his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is not what it seems. I've been painted as a villain, but today you'll hear the truth." His tone was smooth, almost persuasive, but James could see through the facade. Greg's arguments were laced with half-truths and manipulations, and as the prosecution began to present its case, the cracks in Greg's defense became evident. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Surveillance footage from the night of the vandalism, financial records linking him to the counterfeit operation, and testimonies from former accomplices painted a clear picture of his guilt. When it was time for James to testify, he spoke with calm authority, recounting the events that had led to Greg's downfall. His words were measured, focused on the facts, but they carried an undeniable weight. By the time the trial entered its final phase, it was clear that Greg's self-representation had done more harm than good. The prosecution's closing arguments were compelling, leaving little doubt in the minds of the jury. After deliberating for less than an hour, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts. As the judge read the sentence minus 15 years in prison, with no chance of parole, Greg's confident demeanor finally crumbled. He slumped in his chair, his face pale and expressionless. James watched in silence, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Justice had been served, but the toll of the ordeal was undeniable. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed James for a statement. He raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "Today's verdict marks the end of a difficult chapter," he said. "But it also serves as a reminder that accountability matters. My focus now is on the future, on rebuilding trust and continuing to serve our community with the values we stand for." The reporters nodded, their cameras flashing as they captured James's resolute expression. In the weeks that followed, the dealership flourished. The community rallied around James, and the business became a beacon of hope and resilience. New initiatives were launched to support local charities, and the dealership earned recognition as a model workplace. One evening, as James locked up for the day, Kyle approached him. "Mr. Harris," he said, "I just wanted to thank you. Working here has changed my life." James smiled, clapping Kyle on the shoulder. "You've earned your place here, Kyle. I'm proud of the man you're becoming." Kyle nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "It's all because of you, sir." As James walked to his car, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The battles he had fought had been worth it. He had not only protected his business, but had also built something that truly mattered. But as he drove home, he couldn't help but wonder what new challenges might lie ahead. Life had a way of testing even the strongest resolve, and James knew he would face whatever came next with the same determination that had carried him this far. The question was, how would he continue to lead and inspire, ensuring that the lessons of the past would guide the future? Months passed, and the dealership thrived. Under James's leadership, it became a cornerstone of the community, known not just for its quality vehicles, but for its commitment to integrity and fairness. Employees flourished in the positive work environment, and customer loyalty soared. One crisp autumn morning, James arrived at the dealership to find a letter waiting on his desk. It bore the seal of the local mayor's office. Curiosity piqued, he opened it and read, "Dear Mr. Harris, in recognition of your extraordinary contributions to our community, it is our honor to invite you to receive the Community Leadership Award at this year's Civic Recognition Gala." James smiled, humbled by the acknowledgement. He had never sought accolades, but knowing that his efforts had made a meaningful impact warmed his heart. Rachel entered the office moments later, her face lighting up as she saw the letter. "That's amazing, James," she said. "You deserve this." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not just about me, Rachel. This award belongs to everyone who's been part of this journey." Rachel grinned. "Then, let's celebrate together." The Civic Recognition Gala was held in the town's Grand Hall, a historic building adorned with elegant decorations for the occasion. James arrived with his daughter, Lisa, who beamed with pride. Rachel and several employees also attended, eager to support their leader. As the evening progressed, the mayor took the stage, delivering a heartfelt speech about the importance of community and resilience. Then, he turned his attention to James. "Tonight, we honor a man who embodies the spirit of this community," the mayor said. "Through his unwavering dedication and leadership, James Harris has shown us what it means to stand up for what is right, even in the face of great adversity." James was called to the stage, where he accepted the award to a standing ovation. As he held the plaque, he took a moment to address the audience. "This award is not just for me," he began. "It's for every person who believed in the values we stand for. Together, we've shown that integrity and respect can overcome any challenge. I'm deeply grateful to this community for your support, and I'm proud of what we've accomplished together." The crowd erupted in applause, and James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The trials of the past year had tested him in ways he never imagined, but they had also brought out the best in him and those around him. After the gala, James and his team gathered at the dealership for a small celebration. Laughter and camaraderie filled the air as they reflected on how far they had come. Hal raised a toast. "To Mr. Harris for showing us what true leadership looks like. Here's to many more years of success and making a difference." The group cheered, and James felt a swell of pride. This was more than a workplace, it was a family. As the night wound down, James stepped outside, looking up at the stars. Lisa joined him, her voice soft. "You built something incredible, Dad." James smiled. "It wasn't just me, it took all of us." Lisa nodded, "But you were the one who stood firm when it mattered most." James placed a hand on her shoulder. "Life will always throw challenges our way," he said, "but as long as we stay true to our values, we'll overcome them." Lisa hugged her father, and for a moment, everything felt right. Though Greg's shadow had loomed large, it had ultimately been outshone by the light of resilience and community. The dealership stood as a testament to the power of perseverance, a place where second chances were given, and respect was earned. James knew there would always be new challenges ahead, but he was ready. With his team by his side and the community behind him, he was confident they could face whatever came next. Because in the end, it wasn't just about selling cars, it was about building something that truly mattered. And that journey was far from over.